Fox News Podcasts presents the Bret Baier Podcast with Fox News chief political anchor Bret Baier.
High-stakes talks in Geneva this week as U.S. and Iranian officials met over Iran's nuclear program while Iran closed the Strait of Hormuz for live fire drills. Russia and Ukraine also continuing U.S.-brokered peace talks ahead of the war's fourth anniversary. No final deals reached, but during an appearance on The Story with Martha McCallum Tuesday, Vice President J.D. Vance said this about the talks.
You know, in some ways it went well. They agreed to meet afterwards. But in other ways, it was very clear that the president has set some red lines that the Iranians are not yet willing to actually acknowledge and work through. So we're going to keep on working it. But of course, the president reserves the ability to say when he thinks that diplomacy has reached its natural end. We hope we don't get to that point. But if we do, that'll be the president's call.
Back home, the White House is pushing back on state-level AI regulation, opposing a Utah bill it calls unfixable, as the Pentagon flags AI firm Anthropic as a potential supply chain risk. With that, let's bring in our panel, co-host of The Five and Democratic strategist Jessica Tarlov, Targeted Victory Chief Communications Officer Matt Gorman, and Fox News Senior White House Correspondent Peter Doocy. Peter, at the White House, is there optimism? You know, but Witkoff and Kushner, Steve Witkoff and Jared Kushner, had two rounds of talks, one with the Iranians and one with Russia and Ukraine in Geneva.
There's some optimism just because the talks are continuing and the Iranians are saying they'll be back in 2 weeks. But that's not, things have not progressed to the point that President Trump is telling aircraft carrier strike groups that they can stop steaming towards the Middle East. All of the pieces are being put in place for these, for the president to have options if these talks fall apart and the diplomats at any level on the U.S. side remain unconvinced that the Iranians are not trying to build a nuclear weapon.
Yeah, and then any sense about Russia-Ukraine?
The Russia-Ukraine talks are trickier because President Trump keeps getting assurances every time that he talks to Putin, times that we know about, times that he doesn't. That, or rather calls that we don't know about, that Putin is interested in ending things soon. He hears that from the Russian side. He hears that from the Ukrainian side. And there's a lot less optimism that that one is going to end anytime soon.
Yeah, Jessica, how do you see it as far as this international play? I know a lot of focus is what the politics of the midterms and how that lines up domestically, but he's doing a lot of things around the world.
Absolutely. And I think it was a pretty bipartisan salute for Secretary of State Marco Rubio at the Munich Security Conference, got a standing ovation from a lot of key partners. I was certainly heartened to hear, his defense of Western values and the post-World War II order, obviously calling on Europe to step up to some degree. But I think that it was like everyone breathing a bit of a sigh of relief, I guess I would say, at least on my side of the aisle, to hear that kind of communication. When it comes to the Iranian talks, though, it was interesting to hear Vice President Vance, and I was on with Martha right after him, talking about how we could get somewhere with a promise from Iran, or a signed deal, I should say, not just a promise, to scale back the nuclear program, versus the fact that we've heard Rubio say in the past that he also wants some caps on the missile defense program, and to also make sure that they stop funding terror all over the region, which takes American lives regularly. So that contrast stuck out to me, and I'm interested to see what the product is out of this, but remain hopeful, and also, that we don't have to put any boots on the ground. I know the president has said he's not going to do that. But obviously, when you look at the kind of military buildup in the region, your head goes to a certain place. And it's nowhere that I think the Americans in general, no matter how you vote, want to return to. So optimistic about that, but agree with Peter's assessment on the Ukraine front, where it seems like Russia has not moved at all, even through these years of quote unquote discussions.
And Matt, there's even, pushback or skepticism on the Republican side about, what the next step in Iran looks like. You can have this buildup of military assets, and we haven't seen this kind of buildup, not only Navy, but Air Force equipment moving to the region in a long, long time, really having covered the Pentagon all the way back to Iraq. But you can have all of that and not have a ground force, and that's really the question, even for Republicans.
Absolutely, right? I mean, I think I go back to, how a few weeks ago when, there was a talk of what could happen in Iran, the protests were at its peak, and, for a little bit of baseball parlance, Trump took a pitch. Now, I don't think he's necessarily take more pitches, but I think if Iran pops off, or he doesn't believe that they're entering these talks in good faith, or he gets frustrated, I think that could create a real opening, and you could see a different response than we saw a couple weeks ago. But look, I mean, at the end of the day, I think we feel far more confident in how things possibly could change in Iran because we did over last summer, right, with those targeted strikes. And I think also when you go to Ukraine, just the Europeans insist on inserting themselves, and in some ways rightly so. They need to take a leadership role, but their demands, I think that they're putting on Zelensky make it harder for everyone to get to a deal, where Iran and us could get in a room, and if we don't like what we hear, we're far more likely to just simply take matters into our own hands within reason. I think we'd feel comfortable about that. But I think you're right. I think I put far more optimism on the Iran side than the Ukraine-Russia side.
Peter, I've seen and heard the president kind of concede in recent days that it's really tough in the midterms and, it's historically really difficult. Are they getting to a place where they're kind of acknowledging that it's just not going to happen, even though it's a long way away?
Yes, they want the word out there now for everybody like us on a podcast that might be shifting focus to the midterms to know that history is not on their side. President Trump is starting to frame that as not only do sitting presidents have a bad midterm, but he's not on the ballot. And so we heard from Susie Wiles a couple weeks ago, President Trump is going to do a lot more domestic travel to support some of these candidates. We're going to see him go down this week on Thursday to Georgia to try to put his thumb on the scale in this really crowded primary fight to replace Marjorie Taylor Greene. We think that he is going to try to stay as involved as he can, including just going to really safe MAGA red districts, because it seems like, depending on what poll you look at, the House and possibly even the Senate could slip away.
And that's how Democrats see it, right, Jessica?
Yep, absolutely. We're just glad that everyone's speaking the same language. It's nice to not be out there on the cliff screaming, "You guys, we could do this," and now getting some backup. I mean, obviously, history would indicate that Democrats should take back the House. There are people who are talking about 30, 40 seats. I'm not there yet, but you're seeing signs of it. A lot of retirements, a lot of massive overperformances, flipping seats that Trump took by 15, 20 points. And the move now, and you see this everything from polling to the betting markets, that the Senate map is opening up as well for Democrats is something that we like to see. I think we have to be very strategic about it. We have spent hundreds of millions of dollars on unwinnable seats before. I've, given to many an Amy McGrath in my day, but we feel really good about what's going on in North Carolina, what could be in Maine. Iowa is looking very interesting. Sherrod Brown is running a strong campaign. I think it's the first high-profile Senate campaign where now there's an Epstein element to it, where he's going after his Republican opponent for getting, I think it was a $100,000 donation. So, we are feeling good about our chances and the fact that we'll be able to advance an agenda that will appeal to Americans across the country.
Panel, we'll hold it right there. But, Matt, there's a lot of time, and there's a lot of ways that Democrats could step in it, number one. Number two, there's also a lot of time for the economy to potentially do all the things that economic experts say it may do.
Absolutely. I mean, look, Republicans laid down a bet a year ago plus, where they essentially said, look, we're going to make the economic conditions as good as we can and run on that. And you're seeing some really good glimmers of hope. Jobs numbers were good. Inflation is down. And the Republicans have to see that bet through. I mean, in so many respects. And look, I was at the NRCC in 2018, so I know what a Trump midterm is like and how energized the liberal base is. And remember, in 2018, we actually gained seats in the Senate, even though we lost the House. I don't think it's going to happen this time. But I'm watching the Senate really closely, too. I mean, obviously, Susan Collins had a strong launch. Everybody left her for dead in 2020, and she came back and won very surprisingly. I think I put history on her side again. But you're right. There are some areas that we need to shore up. And I'm really watching that Senate map closely because it does affect things like the Supreme Court and cabinet nominations. There are things in the last 2 years of a presidency, even though, Trump might not have, heavy legislating to do, that can absolutely immobilize an agenda, to say nothing of, impeachment proceedings. We saw that during the first Trump term. So, the Senate is big, and I'm watching that really, really closely.
Yeah, and Peter, we're a week away from the State of the Union address. Oftentimes, there are laundry lists of things to do that the president wants Congress to do, and then they throw in, characters, people, families up in the rafters that tell the story of policy that they've had success with. But is there a possibility that there's some kind of long ball in the State of the Union this year that helps reframe where Republicans are heading into the midterms?
Absolutely. And so much of what President Trump has filled his first year plus back in office with are these legacy foreign policy achievements, right? He's talking about the wars that he has had a hand in ending. This week, we're going to see the beginning, the first ever meeting in Washington of the Board of Peace. These are things, foreign policy focused things that will define this second term. But foreign policy is not always something that is guaranteed to help a president win the midterms. And so I think there could be some kind of long ball, but I think it is going to be a reset. He's got the bully pulpit. All the networks are going to have to take his full address the whole time. So he's going to talk about why Republicans, he thinks, are the party of affordability.
And last thing, Jessica, what happens when there's a partial government shutdown and no one pays attention?
I don't know. I don't know if that's better or worse, if there's a chance that your team is going to get blamed for the government shutdown. I traveled yesterday 2 days ago from San Francisco back to New York City. It was day one of this shutdown, and there was no trace of it anywhere. I was talking to someone who works in the airport. They said that the TSA officers that were there actually were contractors and not DHS employees anyway. So they wouldn't be affected by the shutdown. I think that's the first thing people are thinking about, like what the airport experience will be like. My top of the list, though, is what goes on with FEMA, because if there is some natural disaster, it is tough to get the government to work properly when it's functioning on all cylinders, right? So that's really scary for people whose lives are on the lines, right? If you live in a hurricane-prone state with what we've had with these huge rains, tropical storms, et cetera. So I think that it could go on for a while because it is going to be hard to notice it in the way that you usually think about with a government shutdown. And I know that Democrats are pretty dug in. There seems to actually be a few points of compromise that even conservative Republicans say, yeah, we could get on board with the body cams, but it seems like the masks, removing the masks from ICE agents, is the real intractable piece of this. And Tom Homan has said, we don't want them to get doxxed, which I totally understand. But Democrats aren't seeming like they're going to compromise on that. And I'm worried we're going to be fighting about that specifically, maybe even for months at this point.
Yeah. And Matt, how do you think that turns around? I mean, do Republicans then say, listen, we've negotiated on this. We think it's extreme. ICE has been funded through 2029. So what exactly is happening here?
Exactly. And it goes back to the fact that I was really surprised Democrats took the 2-week deal Thune gave them a couple weeks ago. I mean, look, 3 weeks ago, this issue was red hot in a way that national stories in Washington tend not to reach normal people. And by taking 2 weeks, 2 weeks is an eternity. And, it's really dulled, I think, the impact of this story. And you're right. It's not going to be noticed in the same way. You're right. ICE is totally funded. The FAA is not included in this shutdown. So you're not going to worry about air traffic controllers right now. Jessica makes a good point about TSA contractors. So, Are there some effects when people start going on spring break in another month or two? Maybe, but you're right. I mean, and I will say this too, body cameras are in many ways some of the best, most conservative reforms in law enforcement and legislation in a generation, because we finally have gone from a place where being told by the legacy media how an interaction between a criminal possibly and law enforcement happened to seeing it on camera. And so that's something we welcome. But you're right, mass, putting these ICE officers at risk, we're not going to do. So this could be intractable for a while until normal people feel the effects.
All right, guys, thanks so much. Now for a bit of history. On February 1st, 1790, the U.S. Supreme Court met for the first time in the Royal Exchange Building in New York City, and then the nation's capital. Chief Justice John Jay presided over the session after President George Washington had appointed 6 justices under the Judiciary Act of 1789. Although the court didn't hear any cases that year, this moment marked the beginning of what would become the highest judicial body in the United States. That'll do it for this week. You can hear more of this series at foxnewspodcast.com or wherever you download your favorite podcasts. Make sure to leave a rating and a review. We want to hear from you. For Jessica, Matt, and Peter, I'm Brett Baer. We'll see you next time. Listen ad-free with a Fox News Podcast Plus subscription on Apple Podcasts, and Amazon Prime members can listen to this show ad-free on the Amazon Music app.